I learned the hard way that helping neighbors can turn into a legal nightmare, a full-blown war that cost me my peace of mind before it cost the person who started it everything she had. For 12 years, I had been a ghost in my own neighborhood, and I liked it that way. I paid my dues, I mowed my lawn, and I minded my own business. My company, a small but successful landscaping and snow removal service, kept me busy enough that when I came home to the quiet streets of Oakwood Creek, all I wanted was solitude. I was the guy who owned the big plow truck, the one people waved at but didn't really know. That was the perfect arrangement. Oakwood Creek wasn't fancy. It was a comfortable, middle-class subdivision carved out of what used to be farmland. The houses were solid, the yards were decent-sized, and the homeowners association was, for the first decade I lived there, mostly a formality. It existed to manage the contract for mowing the bit of common land by the entrance and to send out a yearly reminder to keep our trash cans out of sight. The meetings were attended by a handful of retirees with nothing better to do. It was a benign, sleepy entity that collected a modest fee and otherwise left us all alone. It worked because we were, by and large, a community of reasonable people. We took care of our own properties and helped each other out when needed without needing a rulebook to tell us how. That all changed the year Brenda Miller got herself elected to the HOA board. She and her husband had moved in about 2 years prior, into the corner house with the immaculate, chemical green lawn. Brenda was a woman who seemed to have been born with a clipboard in one hand and a list of infractions in the other. She was in her late 40s, with a severe haircut and a perpetual expression of disappointment, as if the entire world was a poorly managed project she was reluctantly forced to oversee. She started by actually attending the HOA meetings, then by volunteering for secretary, and within a year, through a campaign of sheer, unyielding persistence, she was the president. The few old-timers on the board were either charmed by her initiative or simply too tired to resist the tidal wave of her ambition. Her reign began not with a bang, but with a trickle of memos. The first was about mailboxes. The old, varied collection of mailboxes was to be replaced by a single, board-approved model. It was an ugly, expensive, plastic thing that looked like a miniature barn. There was grumbling, but most of us just sighed and paid the $200 to have the new one installed. Then came the rules about lawn ornaments. No gnomes, no flamingos, no decorative flags that were not the American flag, and even that had specific rules about illumination and hours of display. Each new rule was a small annoyance, a minor erosion of the live-and-let-live atmosphere that had defined the neighborhood. We tolerated it because fighting over a garden gnome seemed foolish. We didn't see that she was testing the fences, checking for weaknesses before launching her real campaign. The winter of her second year as president was brutal. It started with a cold snap in November and didn't let up. By mid-January, we were hit with the kind of snowstorm that local newscasters give dramatic names. They called this one Snowpocalypse 2024. It dumped nearly 3 feet of heavy, wet snow on us in less than 24 hours, and then the temperature plummeted, flash freezing the whole mess into a solid block of ice and misery. The town plows were overwhelmed. Main roads were barely passable, and residential streets like ours were completely forgotten. For 2 days, Oakwood Creek was cut off from the world. This was my element. My business was built for this. I had a heavy-duty pickup with a commercial-grade V-plow, the kind of rig that could move a mountain of snow without breaking a sweat. After clearing my own long driveway, I did what I always did. I drove over to Mr. Henderson's house. He was in his 80s and lived alone. Then I cleared the driveway for the Gables, a sweet elderly couple who I knew had medical appointments they couldn't miss. After that, I just kept going. It felt wrong to have the equipment and not use it. I cleared the cul-de-sac, pushing the massive snowbanks into a neat pile on the common area island. It took me the better part of the morning, but by noon, our little section of the neighborhood was free. People waved from their windows, and a few came out to offer me coffee and thanks. It was the most I'd interacted with my neighbors in years, and it felt good. That good feeling lasted until I saw her marching down the street. Brenda Miller, bundled in a pristine white parka that made her look like the Michelin Man's angry wife, was heading straight for my truck. I was just finishing up, angling the plow to make one last clean pass, when she planted herself directly in my path, holding up a hand like a traffic cop. I put the truck in park and rolled down the window, the frigid air blasting my face. "Morning, Brenda," I said, trying to keep it friendly. "Bit of a storm, who?" She didn't return the greeting. Her face was pinched with fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I was taken aback. "I'm clearing the street," I said, stating the obvious. "Figured I'd help everyone get out." She pointed a gloved finger at the front of my truck. "You are operating unauthorized commercial equipment on community property. That is a direct violation of Bylaw 17, Section C." And I stared at her, genuinely confused. I had read the bylaws once, years ago, and remembered nothing of the sort. "Brenda, it's a snowplow. People are trapped in their houses. The town isn't coming for days. The board has a contract with a bonded and insured snow removal service," she snapped. "They have been notified of the situation and will be here in due course. Your vigilantism is not only unnecessary, it is a liability. What if you damage the asphalt? Or hit a curb? Who pays for that? You?" Her argument was so absurd, so completely detached from the reality of the situation, that I almost laughed. "The bonded service is probably still trying to find the main highway," I said. "I'm just trying to help my neighbors." "You are not helping," she insisted, her voice rising. "You are violating the rules. The rules are in place to protect the community, to maintain standards. If everyone just did whatever they wanted, we would have chaos." She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "I am issuing you a formal warning. Cease and desist immediately. If you move this truck one more inch, I will levy the maximum fine allowed under the covenants. And I will be watching." Without another word, she turned and marched back to her perfectly plowed driveway, a service I later learned she had paid for privately at an exorbitant emergency rate. I sat there in my truck, the engine rumbling, and felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. The war had begun. A week later, the official-looking envelope arrived. It was from the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association. Inside was a letter, typed on crisp letterhead bearing Brenda's name as president, formally citing me for the violation of Bylaw 17C. At the bottom was the fine, $500. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. It was ridiculous. She couldn't be serious. No sane person, no board of reasonable adults, would uphold a fine for helping neighbors in a state of emergency. I figured it was just Brenda on a power trip, and that would be the end of it. I underestimated her tenacity. 2 weeks after that, a second envelope arrived. This one was a second notice, unpaid violation, and the fine had now doubled to $1,000, with a late fee tacked on for good measure. The letter was sterner, referencing additional bylaws about failure to comply and hinting at further legal action. This time, I didn't throw it away. I set it on my kitchen counter, a white rectangle of pure aggravation. I started seeing Brenda more often. She would be out in her yard when I left for work in the morning, watching me. Sometimes, I'd see her driving slowly past my house. It was unnerving, a low-grade campaign of intimidation. The conflict started to spill over, affecting people who had nothing to do with it. The town plows eventually did their job, but the private service Brenda had mentioned never materialized for the rest of the neighborhood. Apparently, our HOA's contract was a low-priority, low-cost agreement that put us at the bottom of the list during a major storm. So while my cul-de-sac was clear, the other streets in the development remained buried for the better part of a week. The mail carrier couldn't make deliveries. A school bus got stuck trying to navigate the icy ruts on the main road into our subdivision. The worst part was what happened to Mrs. Gable. I saw the visiting nurse's car get stuck in the unplowed section of road near her house. The nurse had to park half a mile away and trudge through knee-deep snow to get to her. A few days later, I saw Mrs. Gable's son trying to dig her out with a small snow blower that was no match for the compacted, icy mess. He looked exhausted and defeated. I walked over and offered to help, to bring my plow around. He looked torn. "I'd appreciate it more than you know," he said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "But Mom got a notice from the HOA. Brenda Miller left it on her door. It said that any homeowner who allows unauthorized contractors to perform work on or adjacent to their property would be held liable for any damages and subject to fines. My blood ran cold. Brenda wasn't just targeting me anymore. She was using the other residents as pawns, holding them hostage to enforce her ridiculous crusade. She was punishing an elderly woman for the crime of being my neighbor. That was the moment my annoyance hardened into resolve. This wasn't about a stupid bylaw or a $500 fine anymore. It was about a bully who had wrapped herself in the thin veil of authority to make everyone else's life miserable. I told Mrs. Gable's son to wait, went back to my house, and found the number for a lawyer a client of mine had once recommended. I met with David Chen the following week. His office was in a modest building downtown, a world away from the manicured lawns of Oakwood Creek. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man in his late 30s who listened to my story without interruption, his expression unreadable. When I finished, I slid the 2 letters from the HOA across his desk. He glanced at them, then leaned back in his chair. HOA law is a strange beast, he said, his voice calm. They exist in a gray area. They have the power of a quasi-governmental body but are run by, forgive me, amateurs. Amateurs who get a taste of power and often go drunk on it. He explained that, on the face of it, Brenda was within her rights to levy a fine if the bylaws were written as she claimed. The emergency situation gave me a strong defense, but fighting it would be a costly, drawn-out process of hearings and appeals. Ignoring it is the worst thing you can do, he warned. They can, and likely will, put a lien on your property. When you go to sell your house, you'll have to pay them whatever they claim you owe, plus interest and legal fees. He paused, looking at me intently. This woman, Brenda, sounds vindictive. This isn't about snow removal. This is about control. People like that don't stop. They escalate. His words confirmed the sick feeling I'd had in my stomach. David advised that our first step was to go on the offensive, but quietly. You're a homeowner. You have a right to the association's records. Meeting minutes, financial statements, contracts, all of it. Let's start there. We need to see the books. He drafted a formal request letter for me to send to the HOA board, citing the specific state statutes that required them to provide the documents within 30 days. I sent it via certified mail the next day. A week later, I received a terse email from Brenda acknowledging the request and stating that the documents were being compiled. The 30 days came and went. I heard nothing. David sent another, more forceful letter. Finally, almost 2 months after my initial request, I got another email from Brenda. She informed me that the relevant documents were available for me to pick up. When I arrived at her house, she didn't invite me in. She handed me a single, flimsy cardboard box from her doorstep. It was filled with a chaotic jumble of loose papers. There were bank statements, crumpled receipts, handwritten notes, and a few printed agendas. It was a complete mess, a deliberate act of non-compliance disguised as cooperation. There was no order, no cohesion. It was designed to be impossible to decipher. That night, I spread the contents of the box across my dining room table and began to sort. It was a painstaking process. For hours, I pieced together a fractured picture of the HOA's business. The contract for the snow removal service was in there, just as I suspected. It was a rock-bottom price for emergency services only after all municipal roads are cleared, which essentially meant never. The landscaping contract for the common areas, however, caught my eye. It was with a company I'd never heard of, Prestige Garden Solutions. The invoices from this company were frequent and high. $5,000 for spring planting, $3,000 for seasonal mulching, $8,000 for tree pruning and health assessment. As a professional landscaper, I knew these prices were wildly inflated. I could have done the same work for a third of the cost and still made a healthy profit. The quality of the work at the entrance didn't justify the expense either. The mulch was thin, and the flowers were cheap annuals from a big box store. Something felt wrong. I looked closer at one of the invoices. The address for Prestige Garden Solutions was listed in a neighboring town. Out of curiosity, I typed it into a search engine. The result popped up instantly. It wasn't a commercial building. It was a small, single-family home. I switched to the county's property records website and typed in the same address. My heart began to beat faster as the page loaded. The owner of the property was listed as Gary Miller. I did another search. Gary Miller was Brenda's husband's brother. It all clicked into place with a sickening thud. Brenda wasn't just a petty tyrant obsessed with rules, she was a thief. She had created a shell company in her brother-in-law's name and was using it to funnel HOA funds into her own family's pockets. The inflated invoices, the shoddy work, the resistance to providing financial records, it all made perfect sense. She wasn't protecting the community's standards, she was robbing it blind. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a week later. Another envelope arrived, this one thicker than the others. It was addressed to Oakwood Creek homeowner. Inside was a letter from Brenda, announcing a special assessment to cover a critical budget shortfall. She wrote about rising costs and unforeseen maintenance expenses. To ensure the continued financial health of the association, the board had voted to approve a one-time retroactive assessment. The amount was staggering. My share, based on my property's assessed value, was $8,152. It was due in 60 days. I stared at the number, a cold, hard knot of fury tightening in my chest. This was it. This was her endgame. She had bled the accounts dry with her fake company, and now she was forcing all of us to pay to cover up her crime. The $500 fine for plowing the snow seemed like a joke now. This was grand larceny disguised as a homeowner's fee. I picked up the phone and called David Chen. "I think I've got her," I said, my voice shaking slightly with adrenaline. "I've got everything." Armed with the invoices, the property records, and the new special assessment letter, I had moved from a defensive crouch to an offensive charge. David confirmed my suspicions. What Brenda was doing was not just a conflict of interest, it was textbook fraud and embezzlement. "This is no longer an HOA dispute," he told me, his voice grim but excited. "This is a criminal matter. The special assessment is her trying to cover her tracks. She's getting desperate." Our strategy shifted immediately. We were no longer trying to get a fine waived, we were building a case to dismantle Brenda's entire corrupt operation. David advised against going directly to the police just yet. "They might see it as a civil matter and tell you to sue," he explained. "Our best move is to expose her in front of the entire community. Public pressure is our strongest weapon. We need to turn her own authority against her." The annual HOA meeting was scheduled in 3 weeks. It was the perfect venue. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. I spent my evenings not in front of the television, but in front of my computer, creating a presentation. I scanned the fraudulent invoices, took screenshots of the property records linking Prestige Garden Solutions to Brenda's brother-in-law, and created a spreadsheet that showed a clear correlation. As the payments to the fake company increased, the HOA's reserve funds plummeted, leading directly to the need for the special assessment. I laid it all out in a simple, undeniable timeline. Meanwhile, I started talking to my neighbors. Not just about my fine, but about the $8,000 bill that had landed in all of their mailboxes. The grumbling that had started with the mailboxes had now become a roar of outrage. People who had never cared about the HOA were suddenly very interested. I spoke with Mr. Henderson, who had been on the original, pre-Brenda board. He was horrified. "We always kept a healthy reserve," he said, his old eyes flashing with anger. "We ran this place on a shoestring, and we were proud of it. Where did all that money go?" I didn't show him my evidence yet, but I told him I had serious concerns about financial mismanagement and asked if he would support a call for a full, independent audit at the meeting. He agreed without hesitation. I spoke to Mrs. Gable's son, to the young family across the street, to the couple who ran the local diner. The story was the same everywhere. The assessment was a devastating blow, a financial burden they couldn't afford. They felt powerless and angry. I told each of them the same thing: come to the annual meeting. We have a right to ask questions. We need to stand together. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse, a small building that usually sat empty, was packed. I had never seen more than 10 people at an HOA meeting before. Tonight, there must have been over 100. The air was thick with tension and resentment. I saw faces I barely recognized, people who, like me, had preferred to remain anonymous. Brenda's $8,000 demand had done what her petty rules never could. It had united us. I set up my laptop and a small projector I had borrowed from a friend, placing it discreetly at the back of the room. David Chen was there, sitting in the front row, looking like just another concerned homeowner. Brenda and the 2 other board members, a quiet man named Frank and a woman who always seemed to be knitting named Carol, sat at a folding table at the front. Brenda looked smug. She likely interpreted the massive turnout as a sign of her own importance, a testament to her leadership. She had no idea she was walking into an ambush. She banged a small gavel to start the meeting. She went through the initial agenda items with brisk efficiency, minutes from the last meeting, old business. Then she arrived at the main event. The next item on the agenda, she announced, her voice resonating with false gravity, is the ratification of the 2024 special assessment. As I explained in my letter, this is a necessary measure to ensure the long-term solvency of our association. She launched into a prepared speech filled with jargon about deferred maintenance and capital improvements she was trying to bore everyone into submission. When she finished, she asked, "Are there any questions?" Before anyone else could speak, I stood up. "I have a few," I said, my voice loud and clear in the silent room. Every head turned towards me. Brenda's smile tightened. "Of course, Mr. Jackson," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I'm sure you have many opinions, particularly about your outstanding fines." "This isn't about my fines," I said calmly. "This is about the budget shortfall. I've reviewed the financial documents you provided, and I'm having trouble understanding some of the expenditures. Specifically, the payments made to a company called Prestige Garden Solutions." I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she recovered quickly. "They are our primary landscaping contractor," she said dismissively. "Their rates are competitive, and their work is excellent." "Is that so?" I replied. I clicked a button on the remote for my projector. The first image flashed onto the wall behind her, a copy of an invoice from Prestige Garden Solutions for $5,000 for annual planting. "I'm a landscaper myself, Brenda," I said, my voice echoing in the hall. "And I can tell you that the work performed at our entrance, a few flats of petunias and a bag of mulch, doesn't cost $5,000. It barely costs $500 each." A murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's face was turning pale. "We value quality," she stammered. "We don't cut corners." I clicked the remote again. The next image was the screenshot of the county property records. It showed the address of Prestige Garden Solutions and its owner, Gary Miller. "Is Gary Miller a relative of yours, Brenda?" I asked, my voice flat. The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Brenda stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. That's an invasion of privacy," she sputtered. "Is it?" I countered, my voice rising with righteous anger. "Is it an invasion of privacy to ask where our money is going?" "Our money, Brenda." I clicked through the next slides, showing invoice after invoice, tens of thousands of dollars paid to the sham company. Then I showed them my spreadsheet, the one that tracked the HOA's bank account. The line on the graph went down and down and down, perfectly mirroring the payments to her brother-in-law. "There is no budget shortfall," I declared, turning to face my neighbors. "There is theft. She has been funneling our dues into her family's bank account. And this special assessment? This $8,000 bill she sent to every single one of us? It's not for capital improvements, it's to refill the account she personally drained." The room exploded. People were on their feet, shouting. Brenda was shrieking denials, but her voice was lost in the cacophony. Her 2 fellow board members, Frank and Carol, looked at the evidence on the wall and then at her with expressions of pure horror. They were realizing they had been her unwitting accomplices. Mr. Henderson stood up, his voice trembling with age but clear as a bell. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in the President. I move to remove Brenda Miller from the board, effective immediately. Hands shot up all over the room. It was unanimous. Brenda stared out at the sea of angry faces, her own face a mask of disbelief and fury. Her authority, the thing she had so carefully built and so ruthlessly wielded, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. She grabbed her purse and her gavel and stormed towards the exit, pushing people out of her way. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, she screamed as she slammed the door behind her. David Chen, who had been silent until now, stood up and addressed the crowd. I don't think she'll be calling a lawyer, he said calmly. But I do think the district attorney's office will be very interested in this evidence, as if on cue, 2 uniformed police officers, whom someone had wisely called, walked into the clubhouse. The climax was over, and the fallout was just beginning. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, but in a productive way. The police took statements from me, Mr. Henderson, and the other 2 shell-shocked board members. David Chen handed over a neatly organized file containing all of my research, a roadmap for the prosecution. Frank and Carol, the other board members, immediately resigned. A special meeting was called the following week, and an interim board was elected, with a reluctant but resolute Mr. Henderson at its head. Their first official act was to hire a forensic accountant to conduct a full, independent audit of the last 2 years of the HOA's finances. The legal consequences for Brenda were swift and severe. The district attorney's office didn't hesitate to press charges. With the clear paper trail I had uncovered, their case was airtight. She was charged with multiple felonies, including embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Her brother-in-law was charged as an accomplice. They both pleaded guilty to avoid a trial, likely on the advice of a lawyer who knew a hopeless case when he saw one. Brenda was sentenced to 2 years in state prison, 5 years of probation, and was ordered to pay full restitution to the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association. The total amount she had stolen was just over $90,000. My own vindication was a quiet but deeply satisfying affair. The new board's second official act was to formally void all fines and legal threats against me. The $500 fine for plowing snow was wiped from the books as if it had never existed. They issued a formal letter of apology on behalf of the association, thanking me for my actions during the storm and for uncovering the fraud. The letter was posted on the community bulletin board. I was no longer the neighborhood pariah. I was, to my slight discomfort, hailed as a local hero. People would stop me on the street to shake my hand. The quiet anonymity I had once cherished was gone, replaced by a sense of genuine community I hadn't realized I was missing. The reformation of the community itself was the most significant outcome. The interim board, led by Mr. Henderson, worked diligently to undo the damage of Brenda's reign. They drafted a new set of bylaws, stripping out the absurd, controlling rules and replacing them with simple, common-sense guidelines. They put new transparency measures in place, making all financial records easily accessible to homeowners online. The $8,000 special assessment was, of course, cancelled. The money recovered through restitution was put into the reserve fund, where it belonged. They also hired a new landscaping company, mine. They offered me the contract without even asking for a bid from anyone else. I accepted, but on the condition that I would be paid at a fair market rate, and not a penny more. My first job was to rip out the cheap, ugly plantings at the entrance and design something beautiful and sustainable. It felt symbolic, like I was helping to heal the physical representation of our neighborhood, just as the residents were healing its social fabric. The atmosphere in Oakwood Creek changed. The tension was gone. People started talking to each other again. There were block parties and neighborhood barbecues. We had been united by a common enemy, and in her defeat, we had rediscovered our sense of community. 2 years passed. Life in Oakwood Creek returned to a state of peaceful normalcy, but it was a new kind of normal. It was better than before. The HOA was now a functional, benign presence, a tool for community betterment rather than a weapon of personal control. Property values, which had stagnated under Brenda's oppressive rule, began to climb. The neighborhood was a desirable place to live again, known for its friendly atmosphere and well-managed association. My business thrived, and my life was quiet. One snowy morning, much like the one that had started it all, I was out in my plow truck. Another storm had rolled through, not a monster like the last one, but significant enough to require a cleanup. I was clearing the last of the streets under my new, official contract with the HOA. As I rounded the corner onto what used to be Brenda's street, I saw her. I hadn't laid eyes on her since her sentencing. Her house had been sold long ago to pay the restitution. She was getting into a battered old sedan parked on the side of the road, a car that was a far cry from the luxury SUV she used to drive. She had served her time and was out. She looked older, smaller. The severe haircut was gone, replaced by graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The expensive parka was gone, replaced by a thin, worn coat. She looked up as my truck approached, and our eyes met for a brief moment through the windshield. There was no anger in her expression, no defiance. There was just a hollow-out weariness. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was a concession, a quiet acknowledgement of her complete and utter defeat. I nodded back, a simple gesture of my own, and kept on plowing. I didn't feel triumph or hatred. I just felt a distant, detached sort of pity. As I finished the street and headed for home, I reflected on the whole absurd saga. It was a story about how easily a little bit of power can curdle a person's soul, how someone can become so obsessed with the letter of the law that they forget its entire purpose. Brenda thought rules and regulations were what held a community together, but she was wrong. What holds a community together is mutual respect, a willingness to help a neighbor in need, and the courage to stand up to a bully. A tyrant, no matter how small their kingdom, will eventually create the conditions for their own downfall. Their own obsession with control becomes the seed of their destruction. I parked my truck in the driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow on the fresh, clean snow. My neighbors were starting to emerge from their homes, getting into their cleared driveways, heading off to work and school. Life was back to normal. And I was just the guy who plowed the snow. I had never been a community champion or a reluctant hero. I was just a man who wanted to be left alone, who was pushed into a fight he didn't want. But in fighting that battle, I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for, a place where I truly belonged. The quiet competence I had always valued found its purpose not in solitude, but in serving the peaceful community I had helped to save.